You know, I had a script for this video, but it was inexplicably lost to the ether. So we are going to improvise. Hello and welcome to Elemental Yarn. I'm Gavin, and today I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite topics when it comes to storytelling, and that is story structure. So a lot of people get intimidated by the concept of having to know everything that's going to happen in a story before you write it. The idea of outlining or structuring a story is maybe not the most appealing idea because it seems more like work when you put it like that. It seems less creative and painterly and artsy. It seems more like something you have to do and makes it... Some people feel as though it removes some of the creativity from the process because it's all about this raw emotion and just splattering it onto the page and not knowing where it's going to go or what's going to come of it. And there is something exciting about that, but when it comes to actually wanting to create a finished product that people can enjoy, being able to know what you're doing and have a direction, a clear direction of where to go with the story can help quite a bit and can eliminate many drafts you may have to do in the future. Rewriting is going to be an inevitability for any story. You just can't get away from that. But if you discovery write, or if you write by the seat of your pants, or however you want to say it, you're putting yourself in a position of having to do many rewrites before it becomes something that people can enjoy in a palatable way. All right, so I actually watched an interesting video recently. It was by Tale Foundry. Seems like a very interesting channel, and I'd like to watch more of their videos. And this video was called How to Outline Your Story using what they call the Matryoshka Method. And I thought it was really interesting, and it was kind of a unique approach to outlining and thinking about a story and generating ideas for the story. And it was all kind of about an inside-out or an outside-in approach, where you have like nesting dolls of different levels of complexity, and the relationship between these ideas would help you kind of generate a story. And I found it very interesting, but it was kind of presented as if it could be used as an outline. So again, I did enjoy the video, but it struck me that it didn't seem very useful for what I was perceiving it to be. So an outline needs to read somewhat like the story will look like in a brief summation kind of form. So it needs to be able to convey what the story is from start to finish, and it needs to be referenceable. You need to be able to look at that outline in the future and use that to make sure you're on track with where you want your story to go. It's kind of like how when you have a rule book for a board game, you read it once to learn how the game works, and then later on, it also needs to be referenceable so you can look up any rules questions you have during play. It's the same kind of idea. Basically, you're writing a rule book for your story. This Russian nesting doll Matryoshka method I think it was interesting for creating a story, for developing ideas and going from the inside out and looking at different levels of complexity and things like that. But I don't think it actually serves either of those two purposes because A, it's not very readable, and B, it's not referenceable. Let's go into some established methods of structuring a story. So if you've taken a creative writing class, there's a good chance that you were taught the hero's journey or the journey of the hero, which is an idea of the monomyth. It's a very interesting aspect of storytelling that is pervasive across many different cultures and many different religions and philosophies all around the world. And it's interesting because they all kind of follow somewhat of the same structure, which is, well, actually, I'll just pull it up. So here's a representation of it. It's represented as a circle. So the journey of the hero. So first there's a call to adventure, and people point out stories such as The Hobbit or Harry Potter or Star Wars. So there's a call to adventure. So Luke Skywalker is told that he must be a Jedi like his father before him. Bilbo Baggins is encouraged by Gandalf to leave the Shire and go on a grand adventure and be a burglar of all things. Harry Potter is told he is a wizard and he must go to wizarding school. So there's the call to adventure, and there's the refusal of the call, where they say, "Oh, I couldn't possibly. There's no way." Luke says, "I gotta stick around for another season. My uncle needs me." Bilbo says, "I can't go on an adventure. I'm a respectable hobbit." And Harry Potter says, "I'm a what?" So there's the refusal of the call. And then there's supernatural aid / mentor, where there's a mentor character who guides the hero and helps them realize their full potential. And then that's Gandalf, that's Hagrid, that's Obi-Wan Kenobi. And so basically right now we're in the known world. And Then there's the crossing the threshold, where all of a sudden we plunge into the reality of the world and the situation. And so that's when Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru are burned in their home, and Luke has no choice but to move on. That's when Harry is taken to Diagon Alley. He enters the wizarding world for the first time. That's when Bilbo and the crew first encounter goblins, maybe. So that's when we meet new allies and enemies, and there's a road of trials, and there's all the characters begin popping up, and then there's an ordeal, and there's the death of the Mentor. The Mentor has to die. That's important to this. And there's the battle with the brother, temptation, road back, and then after everything, the hero's return. My point is, I'm not going to go into the whole hero's journey here, and even this visualization I think isn't 100% accurate. I think there's a little bit of variety in how it's presented. The most common one I've seen is actually where the journey home is actually half of the circle. Right here, it's a quarter of the circle. But the one I was taught was actually the journey home, where you have to, your adventure is over, now you must return home, takes up an entire half of the circle. So half of the entire story is the hero returning home, which is not very exciting in my book. So my point with this is very specific. And yes, it applies to a lot of different stories, but it doesn't apply to every story. And proponents of the journey of the hero as a writing tool say that it does work. And if it works for them, great, fantastic. But my issue is that it is so specific that in order to make it work and apply to any kind of story, you really have to twist it, and you have to contort it and make it not resemble itself as much. And if you have to do that with a tool, is it really that useful of a tool? For example, there's the death of the Mentor. Oh, well, Hagrid doesn't die in The Philosopher's or the Sorcerer's Stone. He doesn't die. Well, the death of the hero can be more symbolic. It can be, Dumbledore dies later on. Spoiler alert, sorry. Dumbledore dies later on. That fulfills it, but it's like, no, because the first story, the Philosopher's, the Sorcerer's Stone, that's kind of meant to be its own hero's journey, I think, isn't it? Unless you say it's all 7 books, is all one giant hero's journey, but then it's not helpful for outlining the first book, is it? I have so many issues with this. I have so many issues with the journey of the hero. If you don't have a mentor character to guide the hero and encourage them to go on an adventure, then it is not really the journey of the hero. But I can think of plenty of movies where there is no such character and no such struggle that work just fine. You get a movie like The Usual Suspects, which is a fantastic movie, widely acclaimed, great storytelling. If you tried to apply the hero's journey to The Usual Suspects, you quickly realize you have to do that contorting and twisting I mentioned. You really have to just punish and torture the journey of the hero to make it in any way resemble that film. You've got the detective. Is that the hero? Like, who's the hero? I guess it's the detective, right? He's trying to figure things out. Is the hero Dean Keaton through the flashbacks? Is he the hero who's trying to unravel everything? It's really unclear. Is it Verbal Kint? Is it Verbal? Is Verbal the hero in this scenario? Well, he's not really being very heroic. He's more of the Nick character from Great Gatsby, where he's just sort of this narrator. He's just sort of the person through whose eyes we're experiencing the story, until later on there's the giant twist. We figure what's actually going on. So, like, first of all, none of these characters are really easily identifiable as the hero. And then going further, what's the call to adventure? There's nothing like that here. It's a unique kind of story, and it tells a great story. But the hero's journey does not help. If the writers tried to follow the hero's journey when making that movie, they would have made something entirely different that would not have resembled that at all, and we would never have that great movie. And that's just one example. There's plenty of ways you can look at this. There's plenty of other stories you can look at that do not follow this at all. So my point is that the hero's journey, yes, it's a useful monomyth. It's useful if you're telling a very precise kind of story that you want to feel very classic, Aragon and things like that. Sure. If it's useful to you, please continue to use it, and it's fantastic for that. All right, so what are some other examples of story structure? So one of the other main ones that I would say is the 3-act structure. And I talk about movies a lot because movies are a great common denominator, and you can experience a full story over the course of 90 minutes. And there's lots of movies that everyone's seen. So I'll probably reference things like Star Wars and Harry Potter and things like that frequently, because again, they're just great common denominators, and a lot of people have seen them. So the 3-act structure is, if you hear people talking about like, oh, well, this should happen in the 2nd act. Basically, in a nutshell, all that really is beginning, middle, and end. If you're one of those people who begrudge the 3-act structure for being too specific and for being too formulaic, there are versions of it which are too formulaic. Some people go so far as to say, oh, well, on page 17 of your screenplay, such and such should have happened by this point, and this event needs to happen on page 58, things like that. And that's not as helpful. That's getting to too specific territory. But if you look at it just in a nutshell, again, the 3-act structure is just beginning, middle, and end. And then it also has a couple of traits where an element of a story might feel more like a beginning element or a middle element or an end element. So, for example, an introduction to our main character. Well, that feels very beginning-ish, doesn't it? It would feel strange to introduce us to our main character in the 3rd act. Try-fail cycles of the main character or our protagonist or hero or whatever you want to call them attempting to accomplish their goal and failing over and over again. Well, that feels very middle-ish, doesn't it? That's what you usually experience in the middle of a story. A thrilling conclusion where the forces of good and evil or the big event occurs and all the characters are suddenly coming together and clashing in a dramatic way. Well, that feels like an end kind of trait, doesn't it? So the point with any kind of story structure is that once you understand how structure works and what belongs in the beginning, middle, and end of a story, then you can start breaking the rules and you can do really interesting things. So I mentioned the usual suspects. It also follows the 3-act structure, but they do interesting things with chronology and they do flashbacks and there's an unreliable narrator happening and things like that. So it kind of muddies things a little bit. You even get into things like Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, where, again, it's jumping through time constantly, and you never quite know where you're at in the story, but it still has a narrative arc that follows those 3 acts, the beginning, middle, and end. The beginning isn't even the first thing that happens in the actual chronology of the story. It's actually towards the end of the movie. Sorry, again, for spoilers. I should probably spoiler alert some things, huh? My point is, the 3-act structure and just the idea of a beginning, middle, and end is pervasive across every story. I double dog dare anyone to show me a popular story that works, that does not consist of a beginning, middle, and end in some fashion. All right, so now let's get into what's a good way to start outlining and structuring out a story. So you've got an idea. You've got the kernel of a story. You have this concept, you have this character interaction, you have this moment or this scene. You have something in your mind that just drives you to create a story. So first of all, that's amazing, and hold on to that idea. I would write that down on a sticky note in its briefest form, and it could even just say something as simple as boy meets girl, or it could be dude with power to control plants, or betrayal at a funeral, or whatever is that impetus that makes you excited about the story. Hold on to that and don't lose that, because that can be a major motivating factor for you in the future. But then when you start pulling together more pieces of the story and figuring out specific characters and locations. What's the setting? What is the story going to look like? What's the medium? What's the format? How long is it going to be? Things like that. And then once you've kind of figured out what you do want the story to be about, write it down in one sentence. Make a one-sentence outline. And you can't make it a giant run-on sentence either. A one-sentence outline that provides the gist of your story. We don't need any proper nouns, hardly at all, if any. All we need is a character, and that character can be a person or an animal or a force of nature or an ideal. Because obviously there's stories like Love Actually, in which love is the main character. You can get very esoteric with it. But the point is we've got a character who the audience is invested in, who is trying to do something difficult in spite of obstacles. So I mentioned Love Actually. In Love Actually, the main character is Love, and Love is trying to take hold and is trying to make people embrace the love and the spirit of Christmas and everything. And the obstacles are that people and their own personal hang-ups and their own inhibitions and things like that. So a character the audience is invested in, trying to do something difficult in spite of obstacles. That is the essence of tension in storytelling. So your story should have something like that. This is an axiom that I think is pretty much true for any kind of dramatic storytelling. If you're not looking to tell a dramatic story, if you're trying to tell a story of how to repair a carburetor, maybe that's not gonna fit, obviously. Or if you're telling something that's incredibly artsy or esoteric or something that's outside the norm, you don't want to tell a story about someone trying to do something, that's fine. But it does mean that for the most part, as far as I'm aware, you're treading unfamiliar ground, and most people don't know how to give advice for things like that. But assuming you want to tell a story that is dramatic or makes people emotionally invested, that's going to be really the impetus that causes that. Is, again, a character we're invested in trying to do something hard in spite of obstacles. So your one sentence outline should convey that. And this is what I call the compass. This one sentence is your compass. And I say it's a compass because it shows you which way is north. It shows you which way you're going, or which way you should be going. This one sentence outline is something you can read really quickly. If you come back to your story after 4 months of not looking at it because of writer's block or procrastination, you can look at this one sentence and remember what it is the story's about and why it matters. Let's actually make one right now. I'm going to make my own compass line. This is also called a log line in some circles, but that gets a little confusing. I'm going to be making up my own terminology just so no one gets confused about what I'm talking about. So, I'm going to be making up my own words. Sorry to add confusion, perhaps, but I might be lessening confusion. What story do we want to tell? Okay, here we go. Maybe we want to tell a story about a high school theater teacher whose fiance is murdered unexpectedly, and so she wants to avenge his death. Let's see, a high school theater teacher is thrust into a world of espionage and danger when her husband is murdered, and she must unravel the secrets he was keeping from her and avenge his death. Okay, yeah, I think it's a pretty decent compass line. We might be able to refine it a little bit and provide a few more little details here and there, but I think that's a log line. That's a compass line. So, like I said, this sentence is going to be what you refer to whenever you're lost. You find yourself writing down a rabbit hole of scenes that you're not quite sure where they're going. Refer back to your compass line and see if what you're writing is in support of that, because this line is what your story is about with a capital A. And if you find yourself writing scenes that aren't following what your story is about, that's time to reconsider. That's time to figure out, is it worth this diversion? And sometimes it is. Is it worth this diversion? Am I going too far from this? Does that mean I need to get back on track with my compass line? Or do I need to realign and figure out where I want the story to go now? There's something to be said for intentionality. I find this a lot whenever I'm drawing. I used to be big into drawing, and then I kind of fell off of it because it's difficult and frustrating. And one of the main reasons it's frustrating to me is because I would find myself trying to draw something specific. I'd be trying to draw someone in a particular pose, and I would always try and branch out and draw new things, but I kept gravitating back to drawing the same poses I'd always drawn, back to drawing the same kinds of characters I'd always drawn, and it was really difficult for me to branch out and do anything else. So a lot of times I'd be trying to draw a new pose, and it would suddenly become a pose I've already drawn so many times. And while the finished product looked okay and I was somewhat satisfied with it, I was always very annoyed because it's not what I intended to do. It wasn't intentional. I didn't mean to do it that way. I wanted to do something new, but I wasn't able to, or I failed at it. So the same principle can be applied to writing. If you want to write a horror story and you're really into that and you want to I usually write, romances, but now I want to write a horror story. And you start writing the horror story, and then you suddenly realize you're going off on a big romantic subplot. You have to consider, do I want to continue trying to write the horror story, or do I just want to fall back into my old groove and write that romance story again? I would encourage writers out there to stick with their intentions. And even if you find yourself straying back to old habits, if you wanted to write the story in the first place, figure out how to do it. Study other stories in the genre for what you're trying to do. Just commit to it. Okay, so we've got our compass line. Now let's expand out a little bit, because this one line is not going to tell you enough detail about the entire story to be able to confidently write the whole thing. This might be enough for some people out there. If this is enough for you, then you can stop here. But for me, I want to have a little more detail. I want to have a little more guidance. So from here, what we do is we expand out into a summary, or as I'm calling it here, our map. So we've got our compass. It tells us what direction we're going. We can always realign ourselves. Oh, I've drifted to the south a little bit. I need to go back on track. But the next tier up in outline complexity is the map, or the summary. And I think the best way to do this is to give yourself a limitation. Just like our limitation on the compass line was it has to be one sentence and not a horribly long run-on sentence, our limitation here is 3 paragraphs. Beginning, middle, end. Very, very basic. So our beginning, and they can't be massive paragraphs either. It should all fit on a single page. And no cheating by making the font size really tiny and stuff like that. It's got to fit easily on a single page. Beginning, middle, and end, 3 paragraphs. If you want to, you can have, a 1-line sentence for like a prologue and a 1 line for an epilogue. But really, you should try and stick to the 3 paragraphs. So the beginning should introduce the world, our characters, the themes, the genre, introduce the expectations that the audience has, and make sure you deliver on those expectations. If you were watching a movie like The Usual Suspects and suddenly Smaug the Dragon comes in the third act, it would be very jarring and strange because that was not promised in the first act, in the beginning of the story. So that's the beginning paragraph, is introductions, and then the end of the first paragraph is when the main tension is really locked in. And then we're drifting into the 3-act structure a little bit here. But for the most, this really does apply to the vast majority of stories. The journey of the hero is useful for a small sliver of stories, and it's interesting as a historical thing when looking at the monomyth and how pervasive it is across many cultures. But the reality is, it only directly applies to a small handful of stories, so I tend to disregard it. But the 3-act structure of beginning, middle, and end is much more universal, and you see it in virtually every story. So the end of the first paragraph introduces us to the main tension, what that character is trying to do. By the end of the first paragraph, the beginning, the first act, the first part of our map, our main character has locked into an objective, typically. And then the second paragraph is the second act, or the middle, and that's when the character is trying to accomplish that objective. And they try and fail multiple times, typically, because if they succeeded immediately, well, the story ends early. If it just seems so hopeless they'll never succeed for the entire second act, then the audience will probably lose interest because there's so much despair, and it seems like, oh, well, why are they even trying? There's no point. So that's why we typically have the try-fail cycles, is because we want there to be like a glimmer of hope, at least, that they can succeed. Or maybe we know that they'll fail, but they don't know that yet. But we're invested in the results of that. And then the third paragraph is our conclusion, it's our ending, it's our third act, and that's when you're close to your destination, and that's when there's typically a twist that occurs of some kind. The objective changes somewhat, either it reverses on itself, or it's cast in a new light, and then there's a higher objective or something. The point is, it's usually like an escalation or an elevation of the main objective. So, if there was a ticking time bomb that the world was going to explode in 3 weeks, then in the third act, or in the ending part of the story, they realize, oh no, we've only got 1 day, we've only got 24 hours. So that's a map. So if I was going to put this compass line into a map, I would do 3 paragraphs. So let's do it. Let's do it real quick. Let's call her Nancy. All right, well, I have put together some kind of summary. I don't think it's very good, but it's good enough for our example purposes. I won't read the whole thing. A, because I don't think it's very good, but also B, because that would take a long time. So basically, I just made a beginning, middle, and end paragraph. So this would need lots of refinement and tweaking, and I would want to add elements in the first paragraph in the beginning that would recur again and again in the middle and then the end in a twist kind of way. So there are things I would do to change this around quite a bit, but this is like what a first draft might look like, where we've got, now we've added another character that's important to the story, we've added a few more details about what's going on, and there's kind of a twist ending a little bit. Again, it's not good. Now we kind of know a rough sequence of events, or what's going to follow after what. This is one case where I think many drafts are good, because what would you rather write 10 drafts of? A 1-page summary, or your entire 250-page novel? You want to measure twice, cut once, right? You want to iterate on this summary over and over and over again. Don't even tweak the original. What I would do at this point, this is a first draft, I wouldn't even look at this again. I would take this and I would save it, I would keep it separately, but then I would start over and I just write it over again, all from scratch. That's an interesting process, because then it forces you to remember, and you'll actually remember it better than it actually is in a lot of cases. And you'll actually come up with more creative ideas, and it'll kind of naturally have a more cohesive through line for the story. Whereas if you just try and tweak the existing 3-paragraph summary, you'll end up being beholden to it and thinking, oh, well, I gotta stick to this because I've already written it down. But it really frees you when you have to start from scratch again. And maybe even do that a couple of times. And keep each version. Don't ever throw anything away. Show it to people and get their input. Show it to people that you trust to give good feedback. Good feedback is really difficult to get. I will make a separate video on the difference between good feedback and bad feedback. I'll do that at some point in the future. But find someone you trust who's actually able to give you valuable feedback and constructive feedback, both positive and negative, and show it to them and ask what they think. And at this point, maybe even your compass line changes a little bit. Maybe that's refined and you can add one more detail here and there. Maybe you iterate in your compass line as well. You can kind of go back and forth between these two at this point. So the map summary, I mentioned the compass line is really good, again, for aligning yourself for where you're going. Your map summary tells you where you're at so far in the story and what roughly comes next and what kind of the general rise and fall of action is going to look like. So these are both very referenceable at any point. You can read a one-page summary in a couple of minutes. So that's actually, I think, good as well for a bird's eye view. It is a map after all, so you kind of want to see the terrain. You want to see what it will look like in general when it's finished. So then the third step, so maybe you stop here. Maybe you stop with the compass line and the map summary and you're good. Maybe this is the end of it. And I wouldn't blame you. This is great. If you've got a really solid summary and you want to discovery write the individual scenes, I think that's awesome. That's fantastic. Because a lot of times you end up being more creative in the moment when you're forced to improvise as you go. You're like, okay, I know this character needs to undergo this change and they need to go to this place. But how and why? Let's figure it out as I write, and then maybe you'll ideate and come up with some amazing concepts and flavor and descriptions of new characters as you go. So hold on to that creative juice for sure. But if you want to take it one step further, you can go with the record outline, the record. So if this is an exploration thing, you've got your compass, you've got your map, then the record is an account of every single thing that happens on the journey. So this thing can be long. This is something you probably don't want to make a lot of drafts on because, again, you really want to make a lot of drafts of your compass line and your map summary. When it comes to your record outline, this is going to be maybe not every single scene, but the important scenes and what specifically happens in those scenes, or at least what emotions are present, what characters are present, what they're doing. So this can be at least 10 pages long and probably will be a lot longer. It depends on the scope of the story, but if this is for a 120-minute movie, this could easily be 12, 15 pages long because it'll describe, in brief, but it'll describe every single scene and you'll be able to see individual character arcs and what happens to them at every stage in the story. Again, if this was a 120-page screenplay, then this could very well be everything except for the dialogue. And all you'd have to do is go back in and add in the dialogue lines, and then you're done. You've written the story. Or it could just be a 10-page outline of a general scope of like what occurs. So this is useful if you consider yourself an outliner. If you want to be able to know what's going to happen at every step in the story, so you always know what's next. Okay, I've written this scene. What's the next scene? Okay, great. I need to have this scene. Fantastic. If you don't consider yourself an outliner, and you're intimidated by outlines and things like that, maybe this is one you don't do. Maybe you try anyway to try and experiment and get outside your comfort zone a little bit and try something new, because it might turn out that you like it, or it might turn out that you have a particular method that works for you. So maybe this last step isn't for everyone, but I do think, for me, it depends on the story and depends on the project. If it's a project where I'm really invested in creating a finished product, like by a deadline or something like that, this is a situation where I would absolutely make a record outline. And I would want to know step by step what happens, beat by beat throughout the story, so that I can nail that down and make sure it's where I want it to be. And then writing the actual story is pretty fast from there. And I can reliably know what it's going to look like in its detailed form. If I was just writing something for fun and I just wanted to explore ideas and be more freeform with it, I would stop at the summary, at the map summary, and I would discovery write the rest of it, all the little gaps in between. But even with a record outline, you can actually still have that joy of discovery of writing. So maybe in a record outline, you have something like maybe one of the sentences is, Nancy Jenkins discovers that her quiet theater student has smuggled herself aboard the van. Okay, so that's a scene. And we know, okay, that's what happens in the scene. This might be a sentence that occurs in your record outline. But this actually still leaves a lot of room for creativity, because this doesn't describe how it happens or what emotions are there necessarily. We just know, okay, this is the story beat. She discovers this. So when it comes to write it, you might see the sentence and figure out, okay, well, how do I want to show this? Maybe she's at the gas station, and when she's filling up the pump, she sees something rustling around in the back window. Or maybe it happens when she goes over a bump in the road and she hears someone squeak in the back of the van or something. Or maybe she goes to adjust the mannequin in the back of the van and realizes, hold on, this seems too lifelike and it's kind of warm. And oh, shoot, it's my student. Just from this alone, you could come up with an infinite number of options for what this looks like in the actual story. So it could still be very creative and still very discovery writing, because it's up to you. It's how you execute the scene. And this kind of also helps with people who feel as though outlining is too prescriptive. I'm losing out on that joy of discovery and I'm just being forced to stick to exactly what my outline says. Well, first of all, you're not beholden to your outline. You can change it. You can change your record outline as you go, and that's perfectly acceptable, so long as you are still following your compass line. You still want to make sure you're heading in the right direction. But second of all, like I just showed, there's still a lot of creativity to be had here. So anyway, this is how I outline and structure my stories. First with the compass line to let me know what the story is about, so I always know what direction I need to go, and I know if I'm straying too far away from that. If I'm writing this story and I start writing extensively about this student and her Etsy shop where she sells welding art, I really go into like her welding studio and I show the different kinds of metals she's using and stuff like that. It's like, that's interesting, and that would be good to include in the story as something to flavor that character. But if I'm going so in depth about it, and it starts straying away from being a story about a high school theater teacher thrust into a world of espionage, etc., then that's an indicator to me that, oh, hold on, I'm going off the path here. Do I either return or I write a different story about that instead? And then you get your map summary, which again is very referenceable. You can read it before every writing session if you want to. It'll just take a few minutes. And then for when it comes to figuring out just beat by beat what happens, what's next, you got your record outline. This is how I like to do things. It's 3 tiers. It's a 3-tiered cake, 3 levels of complexity, and I think they're all 3 very useful. Let me know in the comments. Is this something you find useful? What's your go-to approach for outlining and structuring your story? For me, outline and structure are very similar because your structure should be evident in at least one of your levels of your outline. For me, the structure is most evident in the summary section, because that's where you can really easily see beginning, middle, and end, and you can see the rise and fall of the action. It's also present in the record outline, but that's a little harder to read at a glance, especially if it is 10, 12 pages long. The structure is there, but it's harder to see because it's so dense, right? There's so much going on, and we're really getting into the details of things. And when you're really zoomed in, you can't necessarily see the wider pattern. So for me, the structure really comes through in the map summary. The compass line, here's another great way to think about it. The compass line tells you why your story is important and why it's emotionally driven and what makes people want to engage in the story and learn more about it. Your map summary shows the structure of everything and shows how it's all being held together. And the record outline is really showing from a detail-oriented perspective every important thing that happens in the story. So anyway, that was me talking for who knows however long. I've been recording for over an hour, so this is probably going to end up being closer to 15, 20 minutes, hopefully. We'll find out. But let me know in the comments if this is useful to you. Tell me all about your preferred method of outlining and structuring. Are they more different for you? Are you a proponent of the journey of the hero and you want to tell me why I'm wrong? Feel free to do so. Like I said, this is just the way I like to do things. Every writer has their own process, and if it works for you, then it is the correct process. My goal here is not necessarily to convert everyone into doing things the way I do them. This is just me showing the way I do things, and in case that resonates with anyone who's watching, maybe it'll be useful to you as well. Well, this has been a video essay on story structure and outlining. I'm Gavin. This is Elemental Yarn. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.